Today's question is, what is the difference between fixed and variable rates and open and closed? And for some people, this is quite simple. For a first-time buyer, if you've never heard this before, you probably want to pay attention. So basically, mortgages come in about, I say, 4 different varieties, although there's some differences, and I'll get to that in a second. So you can have a fixed, and you can have a variable, and you can have an open, or a closed. Now, this is for 96% of mortgages would fall into this category, and I'll talk about the other 4% in a bit. So 96% of mortgages are fixed or variable, so you pick one of the two, and they're open or closed. So fixed obviously has to do with the interest rate, and so does variable, and then open and closed has to do with prepayment. So how much can you prepay? So a fixed mortgage, obviously, as the name sounds, it stays the same for the term. A variable can fluctuate based on what happens in the marketplace. And then an open mortgage means you can leave at any time. So you would actually have a 100% prepayment. And then a closed mortgage can have anywhere from no money that you can pay down to, say, 25% in a best case scenario. And ING Direct is a lender that has a very generous prepayment privilege. So here's the thing, though. If you take an open mortgage, you will not get as good of an interest rate. There was a time a couple of years ago when we could get a really good mortgage on an open, but now basically you are not committing to the lender. So if you can leave, they will not offer you as good of a deal. The other thing to be aware of, that for the most part, open mortgages tend to be also variable rate. So they're not... a fixed open is not a very common mortgage. In fact, I can't even think of where to find one. Somebody could correct me. If you want to send me a note, I'd be happy to post where that is. But for the most part, open and variable are synonymous. Where people sometimes get confused is they think that they say, I want a variable mortgage, and they assume that because it's variable, because they're taking the risk of the interest rate, it's open. Most variable rate mortgages are not open. In fact, but that doesn't mean you can't leave. But you do, if you pay them off. There's usually, on a variable rate mortgage, there's usually a 3-month interest penalty. And sometimes you can get, if you're leaving, sometimes you can get them. If you had a 20% prepayment privilege, you can actually exercise that and reduce your penalty by 20%. That might be a little bit confusing, but if you have questions on that, if you are doing that, just email me and I'll explain to you how to do that. The vast majority of Canadians, we're a very conservative bunch, as you can tell by our banking, and I think the last stats I read, about 66% of Canadians choose a fixed closed mortgage. So they pick this one and this one, and the reason is they want to know for the next however long their term is, if it's 1 year or if it's 2 or 3 or 4, that their interest rate is going to stay the same. A variable rate, there's been studies done, tends to be cheaper. About 90% of the time, a variable rate actually wins. The problem is that some people don't want to take the risk for that 10% of the time when it's when they're actually not going to they're not going to benefit. So in our current market, which is better, a variable or a fixed, it somewhat depends on your situation. But usually, if you're a first-time buyer, my advice is going to be, unless you have a lot of income, my advice is probably going to be a fixed closed, so you don't have to worry about that. For people who have more income and their debt is not as a large percentage, then a variable rate is certainly not a bad option. But again, the specifics can vary depending on your situation. So Canadians are boring. We like a fixed closed mortgage. An open is an option. And maybe I'll cover what an open mortgage is actually when it's useful. So let's assume a fellow buys a house, or a person buys a house, and their plan is to fix the house and sell it in a few months. Fix it up and sell it. So if they're only going to hold on to it for 3 months. Now, in an open mortgage, they are paying more for their interest rate. But if they're only going to be in it for 3 months, who cares? So obviously that's a situation where someone would consider an open mortgage. That's a good idea. A closed mortgage, then just to give you, as of today, so today's November 11th, just to give you an example of how these rates look, a typical open mortgage, a really cheap one would be prime plus 0.5%, and a closed variable rate mortgage, so it has would be prime minus probably 80. So not 80, but 0.8. So it's a big difference. That's over 1%, 1.3% difference in interest rate. So you're paying, if you're going to have that for any amount of time, that is going to make it a lot more expensive. So if you want to go variable, probably for most people a close makes more sense. And then the last thing, so the 4%, who are these crazy people? There are actually mortgages now, and they're called hybrid mortgages, where you can actually, let's assume, I'm going to flip to another screen here. Let's assume a borrower has $200,000, and you see these ads on TV, and she wants a fixed, and he wants a variable. Or maybe they just assume they want to, diversify their debt. So in this case, let's say today, you'd probably be looking at like 359 and probably 2.4 on a variable, so that's prime minus 60%. Now, 4% of Canadians use these mortgages. They are brand new. From the last stats I read, I am not a big fan of them. I think you make a decision. You either decide, okay, am I a fixed rate person? Does this make sense to me? Am I a variable rate person? But kind of taking a little bit of both just doesn't make sense. So there are people that want to use them, but it's certainly not the vast majority of Canadians. You make a decision one way or the other. So if you can't make up your mind, I guess this is an option, but I think maybe just get better advice, and you can hopefully pick one that makes sense. So the 4%, they are the odd ducks that have a little bit of both. And then the line of credit. So the last thing I'll cover is a line of credit and what is how those work. So basically, a line of credit is open. And they have several different names. They can be called a HELOC, home equity line of credit, or just a line of credit, sometimes depending on the institution you're talking to. And a really cheap line of credit today is prime plus 0.5 to prime plus 1.0%. And the way a line of credit works is it's fully open, so you can leave it any time. Obviously, you're paying a higher rate than you would on a comparable prime minus mortgage up here. The other thing is that line of credits have interest-only payments. So all these other mortgages we talked about, they usually have a principal and interest component. So there's principal and interest. With a line of credit, it is interest only. So this can be great for improving cash flow, but it is not a great long-term, for most people, it's not a great long-term strategy because they never pay off their debt. I call it the never-never plan. So you end up, and I see this happen with clients that will have a line of credit for 3 years, and they come back and let's say if it's a $300,000 line of credit, they come back and see me in 3 years and they owe exactly $300,000. And their debt level has not changed at all. So this is you have to be disciplined. And the nice thing about something that pays principal and interest, at least there's an automatic, without you don't have to have the discipline to do it. It just pays it off for you. So I kind of like that. So if you have questions about how these work, you can send me an email. If you can find a fixed open mortgage, send me an email because I'd like to know about it. My email is scott@scottpeckford.ca.